I think it's cool when they give them the argument. People just get the big TIR intro right in the face.
It's kind of funny. It's kind of okay. That's we're getting some kind of annoying echo right now.
Oh, on your side, I don't have anything. But is it you hearing yourself or?
I
We're on a new streaming platform today. If you weren't aware, friends. Yeah, I
you know
mean,
what? I just figured it out. This is 100% my issue. So
yeah. People are saying in chat like it's not audible to anyone else, but obviously if it's audible to you, if you're hearing echo for an hour and a half, you'll be driven mad.
yeah, but I am no longer hearing it. I just made a really stupid mistake. I just fixed it.
Did
But
you,
I was
you
gonna,
have two tabs open?
yeah, exactly. But
Nice.
I was gonna say it is a little bit funny because I really like I think the GTA intro music works really well for for what it is, um, and it's distinctive and that's good and blah blah blah, right? But it's like it is sometimes funny because like people who associate me with the show like will assume that I'm like a jazz fan because like that's the you know like it's like
Well,
no,
yeah.
man.
Well, you actually have basically the same music and film taste as Jason.
Yeah, exactly, right. So it's like I like the actual music that I listen to is much more like the TIR opening than it is like what GTA uses, and this is yeah, this is that is definitely one of the things that I originally bonded with Jason about metal and horror movies. Speaking of which,
There's some
it
kind of mob intruding on your camera.
yeah, that's the cat's tail. So he was doing that during Capital class this morning too. I don't know what's going on with him today, but yeah, yeah. Speaking of horror movies, right? So he was. I adopted him from the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. They posted on their
Mm.
Facebook page that they were feeding a bunch of stray kittens there. Figured he comes from a cemetery in Hollywood. He should have a horror movie name, so that's Ash. But in any case, I was going to say actually. So speaking of Hollywood, for anybody who's not doing anything, who's in Southern California and not doing anything on Friday night at 6 p.m. Jason and myself are going to be at the Rainbow Bar and Grill in Los Angeles. Do a our usual hangout for anybody who wants to
They'll
come.
be there. They'll be kissing each other.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. No, so much kissing. That's so yeah. If you want to like surprise your significant other with like something like really romantic, I think like yeah, just don't even tell her until she's leaving the car, right? That's that you arranged to have her come hang out with
you have
Marx's
to, you have to
podcast.
visit two middle-aged podcasters.
So
Um, Silver asked, "Is it trade secret which streaming platform you were using in which you are using? We were on Restream, and this is now StreamYard, which is actually the one I first used. So everything is a circle." I had one final important question to ask you before we start talking about Curtis Yarvin. What do they
yeah,
call this in America? Fruit concentrate, dilutable, squash. That you put this into a glass in a small amount, then you put a large amount of water inside the glass.
uh,
Was it not a thing?
I don't know. I'm not familiar with this thing.
Huh. Well, maybe chat can answer. But Ben, what was the article you wrote 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago?
Yeah. So yeah, we were a bit behind, but this one seemed like one that was worth doing a stream about. So this is called Curtis Yarvin's Nonsense in the New York Times. So Yarvin is somebody who I did a debate with 2.5 years ago. And the fact that now he's getting this, he's getting interviewed in the New York Times, right? They did a big splashy interview with him. Says something about some of the things that are broken about the world right now. So since if you're not familiar with Mr. Yarvin, then first, congratulations on not being too online. You're living your life in the correct manner, and you should continue that. But I am still going to tell you who that is. So Curtis Yarvin is a blogger mostly. He's written some books, and he used to be better known by the name of his old blog, which was Mencius Moldbug. And he is
Guys, what if I was a filthy little disgusting bug?
it's a decision. And yeah, he is a self-described monarchist. And so, given the information that I've given you so far, monarchist blogger who used to be called Mencius Moldbug, you'd be forgiven for thinking that I'm talking about a pretty marginal figure, and perhaps even wonder, why we were talking about him. But certainly you might wonder how it is that this guy is getting the big interview in the New York Times. But this gets us into some of those ways that the world is broken right now. So the current Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, has called Yarvin has called Yarvin a friend, and has positively cited some of his ideas. Peter Thiel, who is a tech billionaire, who, among many other similar acts of political generosity, is basically the person who gave us J.D. Vance, because he was the in the early stages of J.D. Vance's run for Senate. Thiel was essentially his only donor, right before he started to pick up steam. He was
It's really interesting how it works in the United States, because Vance is like genuinely not from an elite background, but like the equivalent politician in the UK would still just not have very much money. But in the United States, you have to be raised first the billionaire class if you want to then become the VP.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit complicated. Look, there are people who do without anything quite like this happening, but in Vance's case, he became prominent originally because he wrote this memoir about that non-elite background you were talking about, Hillbilly Elegy, where he basically throws the people he sort of grew up around. I will say this is like when he was like spending summers with his grandmother, but whatever, in Appalachia under the bus, and talks about their horrible culture of poverty and all this stuff. But
it's basically like a third world diaspora novel, but written about West Virginia.
Yeah, basically, right. There are also definitely equivalents. Like there's a very recognizable kind of Black conservative who will write the same way about urban Black people that J.D. Vance writes about.
You need to pull their damn pants up.
Exactly. Yes. Rural white people. He became popular. Like, he first rose to national prominence through that book, and of course, meanwhile, what the book is about is how he, despite all of that, right, he got into Harvard and blah blah blah, and so he did a lot of very go-getter Harvard graduate things. He did he interned with the judge. He actually worked in a investment capital firm for a little while, which is in fact how he first hooked up with Peter Thiel. And when Hillbilly Elegy came out, I mean, the sort of weird thing about this is back then, like, really annoying mainstream libs loved JD Vance. Like it sort of came out at the perfect time for people who wanted to tell a story about how Trump won because of all of these awful poor white people being awful, to be able to sort of point to it and celebrate it in that moment. But he probably he always had some conservative inclinations, although he also infamously told a friend in some emails that have been made public in 2016 that he thought Trump might be America's Hitler. So he's definitely shifted his politics, but I think that Vance became like a real right-wing ideologue, basically, as far as I can tell, by being radicalized by internet weirdos such as Curtis Yarvin.
But it's not that unusual. It's just unusual that one went to become the vice president.
Yeah, exactly, right. So I mean, in Vance's case, because he knew Peter Thiel, and Peter Thiel, found him interesting because he was, very, because he had been radicalized by, the sort of right-wing weirdos that, Thiel takes an interest in. So then Thiel, again, essentially became the sole funder of Vance's run for the Republican nomination for the Senate in Ohio. I wrote about this at the time. There are, even in the U.S., there are laws about how much you can give to a political campaign. But in the U.S., there are some sort of trivially easy workarounds for these laws. So you can have you can only donate so much money to the actual official campaign, but you can donate however much you want to the super PAC that's supporting the campaign, as long as it's not officially coordinating with the campaign. And then it's also not that hard to coordinate between the two without getting in trouble for it. In fact, in Vance's case,
and even if you don't, it's not that complicated, right? Just spend 100 billion of some guy on TV being like, JD Vance is a good man and the other man is a bad man.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And in this case, they actually were coordinating pretty blatantly. It's just that what they did is that the Thiel funded super PAC, a lot of the stuff that political campaigns would normally do in-house, research on vulnerabilities and things like that, were done through the super PAC because that's where all the money was. And so what they did is they just created this public Google Drive folder where they would put all that stuff. And so presumably you could just write down on a napkin or something the URL for the Google Drive folder. And so you didn't have to have incriminating emails back and forth that would establish coordination. And eventually, of course, reporters found the folder and, whatever. But it was intended to not be particularly easy to find. So anyway, then he became senator, and then after a couple more years of kissing Trump's ass, he became vice president. Right, that's the story of JD Vance. But Thiel was also a patron of Curtis Yarvin, and there are I quote at the beginning of the essay some other Trump world tech billionaires who've said positive things about Yarvin, who included some people who've been very involved in the Trump 2.0 administration. So, this is why this is the larger political context of Yarvin actually, becoming, this extremely strange figure with very, very marginal branding. becoming somebody who, you know, would be interviewed in the New York Times. Because look, I mean, it's not surprising that I once debated this guy, because, like, you know, engaging with various kinds of odd reactionary people is, you know, kind of what I do, right? I mean, as the late Michael Brooks would put it, you know, it's a core brand proposition. But you know, it might otherwise be a little bit confusing how he's in the New York Times, but he is. And
yeah, and maybe now he would turn his nose up at Ben Burgis.
yeah, it's entirely possible that he would. Yeah, I might have caught him at the last time that he would have been willing to talk to somebody like me. So yeah, it was an interesting read. It's
But you said the New York Times article was quite vague posted compared to his previous stuff, which it feels that there's still this quite funny thing with Trump 2.0 where they're like, we're bestriding the world and conquering it and doing what we will. But then they fired that Doge guy for being racist and then hired him back when, like, no one
Oh, did they hire him back? I missed that part.
I think so. Like, they did literally Elon did a poll on Twitter and JD Vance said he should take him back. So I'm pretty sure he did. Like, this is what the VP gets up to.
Yeah, I saw Vance saying they should take him back, which is awesome because, like, some of the stuff that this guy had been saying, right? You know, his posts or whatever that had come to light were like, we should normalize hate of Indian immigrants, and it's disgusting to intermarry. And, you know, it's like, man.
The funny thing with people being like, you know, he was like 18 or 17 when he did this. And it's like, yeah, because he's 19 now.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's not, you're saying that as if he's 40 now. And it's like, oh, you're gonna hold something he said when he was 18 against him. You know, it's like,
and this all happened after COVID.
Like last year. Yeah. And it's like JD Vance is married to an Indian immigrant and has kids with her, right? So it just kind of seems like the amount of self-respect here is not off the charts. And it's, I don't know, it's funny. I saw you know, my friend Branko Marcetic from Jacobin had posted, you know, with things have come to sort of an odd pass when traditionalist conservatives don't seem to mind, you know, having their wives be insulted in public. And you know, I saw somebody had responded to that, be like, this is so stupid. You guys are always trying to get mad at, you know, us for not following values that you guys actually despise. And it's like, okay, one, I think, you know, I mean, inconsistency is inconsistency no matter who points it out. But also, two, I don't know, man. I don't really think this is a value that's particular to, like, Christian conservatives. I think that...
Yeah, I don't think the left is against being nice to your wife. Like, maybe they're against, like, getting married, but once you do, then you should probably be nice to your wife.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like, I think that this is the sort of value that I actually think most people have, regardless of politics or religion. But yeah, Yarvin does in many ways. There are a couple of moments where he's kind of asked about some bizarre things he said, and he doubles down. But, like, for the most part, he does soft pedal his views, you know, for the Times readership. And this is a tendency this is something I've observed in Yarvin in the past, right? That, like, how, like, the basic pitch is the same no matter who he's talking to, right? Like, democracy is actually bad and blah, 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 right? Like, that's all basically the same. But the presentation does vary quite a bit, right? Depending on the audience. There's like a version of Yarvin where he really leans into the edginess, and there's a version of Yarvin where he he really tries to make himself sound reasonable, right? And so like, I don't know, just before the debate that I did with him, I remember I went, it was in Chicago, and yeah, it's funny. I remember some Twitter leftist afterwards was like, "Oh, you just cashed in on this event with Curtis Yarvin." It's like, man,
Then you've done a platform.
yeah, exactly. I've platformed him. It's also like cashed in, like my the the total, like my total compensation for this was that they paid for part of my plane ticket and one night at a hotel, and I guess there was some like pizza the night before the debate, right? That's sorry. There was also coffee and donuts that were set up at the debate site, so there was that too, right? But like,
what month was this?
What's that?
What month was this?
Oh, this was October of 2022.
Okay.
It was.
I was going to
actually,
say, and then he had to go to Chicago in winter, but he didn't. So
yeah, fall, but yeah. It was actually the day before the LA live show. I was like, after the debate, I flew to LA to do that we did with This is Revolution, Left Reckoning. But yeah, I mean, I remember, so I was in Chicago, and I was like, I went for a jog in Chicago the morning of the debate, and I listened to the one that Yarvin had done with Cenk Uygur on the Young Turks, and it was interesting because the debate with Cenk was definitely Yarvin trying to like soft pedal and sound reasonable, whereas I think for me, because most of the audience was in his corner, right? He was comfortable being pretty edgy, and and leaning into just the racism, in ways that that he's certainly not, in other contexts. But the basic Yarvin contention, which again, it comes in like he's a little, there's a lot of ambiguity about it, like exactly what he means by this. But the basic Yarvin contention is that democracy is bad, actually, and monarchy is good, and what we really need is somebody who can be like the CEO of America, and they can run America. In fact, they can run America like a tech startup, and in fact, preferably this person would like actually be a tech CEO. He said that a few times. And when he's in his edgier mode, right, he'll make comparisons to like Augustus, like ending the Roman Republic, right? For how this should be. And when he wants to make himself sound more reasonable, he'll be like, hey, FDR was essentially a monarch. Like, look how like Congress just rubber stamped, anything that he was willing to do. You don't think FDR was bad, do you? Well,
it's interesting because obviously there's another strand of like weird online thought which calls itself monarchism, but that's based on like the ancient lineages of European nobility, which is very much not what Yarvin's doing. Yarvin's almost doing the opposite, where he's like, I want like the technocrats and like complete hyper-modern kind of capitalists that have emerged from America to rule the world.
Yeah, no, that's right. Like he clearly doesn't want like what he's not advocating that like, I don't know, we that
he doesn't want King Charles.
Yeah, he doesn't want King Charles.
Who for one, King Charles is a lib, so
King of America, or the southwestern states that used to be Mexico to be turned over to the descendants of the Spanish Bourbon monarchy, or anything like that, right? So again, there's a lot of ambiguity about just how loose and metaphorically he loosely metaphorically he's using, you know, this term monarchism, but he does, like, even on the most soft pedaled interpretation of what he means by it, he does clearly mean that like a single individual should have like massively more power over the government than anything, you know, that like, you know, what people who've been raised to think democracy is good would be comfortable with, right?
And
Like
he
that.
thinks the checks and balances shouldn't be in the form of like Congress, but more in the form of other things that the US had, of like elite lawyers and judges.
Yeah, I mean, even that's a little bit unclear to me. Like, does he actually want judges to be able to check and balance the power of his, like, you know, hypothetical CEO of America? Maybe not.
Or is he
Right?
just
Like,
saying that to appeal to liberals?
yeah, I mean, he has, you know, he does sometimes. Yeah, I think he's maybe a little unclear on that point. Like, I'd actually like it. I do not recall in the New York Times interview uh, nice him being too explicit about that, but it would be interesting to see him like pressed on that point, right? Like sometimes I've seen him sort of suggest that you should have something that would be sort of like on the model of like, you know, a board of directors, right? You know, but that, you know, nevertheless empowers the CEO to, you know, act like a monarch on a day-to-day basis. But it is interesting. So after I did this debate with Yarvin in 2022, I wrote about it for Jacobin, and part of the point that I was making in that article is that Yarvin, in a certain sense, is actually pretty close to the worldview of a certain kind of lib New York Times reader. And it's interesting to see himself lead into that point in his New York Times interview, right? That he's so, like, at the time, I mean, I was kind of trying to deflate the edgy persona a little bit and be like, look, I mean, he obviously wants to do like the right wing version of it, so there's going to be all kinds of disagreement. But in a certain sense, like, his sort of edgy populist fans might not sort of appreciate the extent to which everything that they hate about liberals is kind of going to be true about Yarvin. I mean, not the, you know, I mean, they might like the fact that he's really, you know, that he's really racist, but like but like a lot of what they hate about liberals is going to be true about Yarvin. So, you know, for example, he makes this big deal, you know, like one of the sort of classic Mencius Moldbug concepts was the cathedral, which is basically Yarvin's melodramatic term for the media and academia, right? The sort of creators of culture and ideological consensus. And
it's
so
like a rip off of Nick Land in a more boring way.
I'm not super. So this actually came up the other day. I don't know a ton about Nick Land. I mean, that's like one of those like names that I've heard forever, but like I would struggle to give you more than 3 sentences of meaningful information about the guy. Like, you know, I guess that's probably worth doing a deep dive at some point. But like,
yeah,
but
for Nick
you know,
Land, the cathedral is much more broad. It's like any effort to make capitalism slightly humane is the cathedral. Like
okay,
like welfare and healthcare and or anything like that is the cathedral.
awesome. Yeah, as far as I can tell, what Yarvin means by it is like cultural and ideological tastemakers, right?
It
And
seems that Yarvin is much kind of more capitalist realist. Well, obviously,
uh,
Nick Land used to be a Marxist, and so kind of I think at least can see threats to capitalism. Well, Curtis Yarvin seems to be very much still embroiled in kind of like the US elite cultural struggle. And so his idea of the cathedral is much more, it's all the elite stuff which libs run and control.
Yeah, right. And I mean, in some ways, I think that's right. I think Yarvin is very focused on sort of American cultural struggle, and even when he's thinking about government, he's like in some ways. I mean, I think there's maybe an interesting essay that to be written here about the influence of like another defector from Marxism, right? You know, very famously, who'd be James Burnham, who who wrote a book called The Managerial Revolution, where his basic thesis is that all of this like Marxist stuff about ownership relations is sort of passe, because like, you know, Burnham actually, when he first wrote this book, his belief was that both the United States and the Soviet Union were examples of this this like society, or were becoming versions of the society where the people who really ran everything were the managerial elite, you know, whether within corporations or the state or whatever. And you know, I think there's overlap between this and things that have been reintroduced to Marxism, as like the PMC thesis, right? That the professional managerial class, right, is like really a class, properly speaking, with its own interests. And but I think there's a different strand of it that's very influential in the new right, and that, you know, Yarvin does represent some version of, right? So like he's that where, you know, I mean, this like again at least intersects with like the rhetoric of Trumpism when you think about like the deep state and all of that, right? I mean, that's all about the sort of power of entrenched government bureaucrats, right? I mean, I think like one of the slogans Yarvin popularized was "Rage," right? Retire all government employees, which
they're doing, right? They offered like 90% of the federal government free severance or whatever.
Yeah, exactly, right. I mean, I think that actually, the sort of the Trump 2.0 does seem much more Yarvin pilled, right? That and you know, this is like I just filed an article about this for MSNBC, which is interesting because you know, at some point soon, you know, I hope to get one of the people who thinks that I'm a lib because I'll sometimes write things for MSNBC now, in a same room with people who think that I'm red brown because I'll sometimes write for Compact or Unheard. But anyway, wrote this for MSNBC basically about the fact that I mean, part of my point in there is that it's ridiculous that libs are so obsessed with like US aid when like there's this other stuff that like is sort of objectively a much, like, if you wanted to make a sort of populist objection to all of this, right, you know, it would be a much better thing to focus on. So like one of the things that like that they're doing right now is they essentially shut down the National Labor Relations Board. So Trump fired Gwynne Wilcox, who's a member of the board, which is just like very blatantly illegal. There's a like the National Labor Relations Act like says like you can't fire a member of the board except for like really specific causes that don't apply here, and you know, all of
Treason.
this. And you know, basically Trump just decided to do the thing that's there's an old Onion headline about Trump, which is that he using the little known who's going to stop me loophole in the Constitution.
Right,
basically,
and Vance, I don't know if it was yesterday or today, he was saying like at some point we just need to start ignoring orders from judges. Like, what right do they have to interfere in? Of course, he's not fully Curtis Yarvin pilled, or he's at least pretending not to be, because he basically said judges shouldn't interfere because he elected them, while Trump has the great mandate of the bigly mandate of the big American people.
Yeah, the great mandate of having won by having won the national popular vote by like significantly less than Joe Biden won it by in 2020.
Yeah, I think in the end he actually got like 49.9, which is pretty funny.
Yeah. He didn't even make it half to over, like he didn't even make it to an absolute majority, and certainly the margin between him and Harris was smaller than the margin between Biden and Trump in 2020, which is just to say, it's like, I don't know. I mean, I'm always like, depending on who I'm talking to, right? Like if I'm arguing with libs, then it's always like, man, you guys really got your clock clean. Like, you need to learn some shit from this. And when I'm arguing with conservatives, it's like, calm down, right? You won by like an unusually tiny margin. But I think both of those are true in their own ways. But yeah, it is. So Trump just decided to they're just going to illegally fire a member of the National Labor Relations Board and see who would stop him. And I think on the calculation that he can get a lot done in however long it takes the courts to tell him that he can't do that. And because he fired Quinn Wilcox, that means that the board is below quorum to make decisions. So there's a certain amount that regional offices can do on their own, but anything the board as a whole has to make decisions about, they just can't do for however long it takes, this to wind its way through the courts, which means that they just had to announce that they can't contest the challenge to the constitutionality of the NLRB that was made a while ago to the U.S. Court of Appeals by SpaceX. So that's also Elon Musk. And so they're kind of, I mean, we'll see, maybe other people will like take up the legal challenge on their behalf. And despite the conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court, like this will be averted. But as of now, it kind of looks like the NLRB sort of was maneuvered into committing institutional suicide. That's like an obvious example. And then, like Elon, like the other, like, has been like essentially through Doge shutting down, entire agencies. I mean, I just saw him tweet the other day, CFPB RIP, about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is So I think that there is a great extent to which this is actually happening, or at least they're taking, they're giving it the old college try, right? They're taking a run at doing it, however successful they will be this time. So Yarvin is very focused on stuff like managerial bureaucrats and the media and academia, like to the point that like he does this weird thing when he talks about the media where he like sometimes will really minimize the actual significance of like who owns media outlets, right? Because it's like, oh, what really matters is like this, these like liberal elites, who fill the newsroom, and and so in fact, it's actually kind of funny. I haven't thought back to this since like in the last couple of years, but there was a point in my debate with him where I was like, look, it doesn't, like, it matters much more what Jeff Bezos thinks than what anybody who works at the Washington Post thinks. Because, Bezos could just like replace those people, right? If he wanted to, like he owns the newspaper, and Yarvin was kind of poo-pooing that. And
I think at that time Bezos was much more willing to just let things run. But then in 2024, with I think also does he own the LA Times or something, where like both the Washington Post and the LA Times basically they wanted to not endorse. They wanted to endorse Kamala. The editorial staff wanted to endorse Kamala, but they ended up endorsing no one. Both of them. I can't remember.
Yeah, exactly, right. So, and I don't remember who owns the LA Times, but yeah, Washington Post is owned by Bezos, who like personally intervened to stop them from doing that. So it's it's a good yeah. So I think that's a good indication of like where sort of focusing on the cathedral as opposed to actual capitalist owners will lead you to miss.
Right, because of course, like the problem is, they're like, well, everyone that's like has this elite media training, they're almost all libs. But in the end, you can just hire idiots. Like there's no fundamental really like way to stop that. In the end, if Bezos wants to just staff the New York Times and the LA Times with like a set of conservative idiots or reactionary idiots, and then just have like some technical staff there to make sure that the newspaper actually runs, then you can do that. And it'll no longer be like the world's paper or whatever, but it'll still run, it'll still print, it'll still influence the United States. And more importantly, it'll remove this like liberal weight the other way.
Yeah. It's so the point I was trying to make in the Jacobin article was that there's actually quite a bit of overlap between the worldview of like a certain kind of professional class liberal who likes the New York Times and the worldview of Curtis Yarvin, right? And because if you think about it, right, like, okay, when Yarvin like does this media critique, right, talks about the cathedral, shaping public opinion, which was also kind of like one of the things that we argued about in Chicago was like whether it is in fact true that like the public just sort of believes what the media tells it to, which was more or less Yarvin's contention, or whether things are a lot more complicated than that. And I brought up some examples of the public coming to conclusions that are hard to explain by it just believing what the media tells it to, like polling on support for negotiated solution to the war in Ukraine, which is like not at all what presumably anybody who Yarvin would count as being in the cathedral supported at the time. But there is a sense in which what he's saying can feel like this sort of distorted reflection of like the Chomsky and Herman like manufacturing consent model of media critique. But I think ultimately the difference is pretty clear. And like I think it's pretty clear even if you read this New York Times interview that not only of course obviously is Chomsky more interested in media ownership than Yarvin is, right? But also like Chomsky ultimately wants people to be exposed to a wider range of perspectives that because he's pro-democracy. He wants people to be able to make up their own minds, right, about important issues, whereas Yarvin doesn't like really explicitly doesn't object to the idea of the public being guided by like an elite. He just wants a different elite.
It's not that he doesn't object to that. He very explicitly wants that, right? That's exactly and clearly what he wants.
Yeah.
Thank you for Kyle G for making your words very big on the screen.
Yes, exactly. And yeah, so like the sort of like the kind of professional class lib who thinks it's very important that people be shielded from misinformation and all of that stuff, right? That there is like they disagree about the directions in which the public should be led, right? But I think there is an overlap that's worth lingering on, right? Between their worldview and
Yarvin. Does Yarvin pretend to be a Christian?
No.
I'm just wondering, like, if that's kind of required for being an influential right winger in the United States.
Not as much as you might think. It's yeah, I mean, Yarvin is actually Jewish, although I suspect a lot of his fans either aren't aware of that or forgive him for it. And
yeah, I mean, I'd forgotten. Oh,
yeah,
never knew.
He, you know, I mean, in fact, I probably the most memorable, the most memorable bit of Twitter anti-Semitism that was ever directed at me was directed by one of his fans that was who was pissed off by what I'd written about him, and they referred to.
I mean, it's the funny thing, right? That if someone asks if you're Jewish, then either they're an anti-Semite or they're Jewish.
Yeah. They were they referred to me as a New York Khazar Marxist, which is funny on multiple levels. Just to start with, I've never lived in New York, but New Jersey at one point. But anyway,
never been to the Khazar steppe either.
Yes, I've also never been to the Khazar steppe, but yeah. In any case, it's Yarvin is a totally secular person, and yeah, there are there are lots of prominent right wingers in the United States who are Christians and wear the Christianity on their sleeve, but it's definitely not a requirement. Look, Donald Trump, I guess, is sort of nominally a Christian, but I don't think anybody takes that very seriously.
Yeah, I mean, he's clearly like the least theist president in the world, in American history, because he most clearly believes of anyone that's ever been president, there's no one above him.
Yeah. I mean, he's also okay, so I think there was a point in 2016 where he was asked what his favorite book was, and instead of giving the honest answer, which would be I've never read a book, he said the Bible, and he was asked then what his favorite passage was. He said he couldn't choose.
They're all just so great.
Yeah, exactly, right. And again, every once in a while these days he'll say something about how Christians are so wonderful, and but he doesn't pretend very hard, right? He I've always said, and obviously this is not literally true, but I think it's only sort of a 40% exaggeration that Donald Trump could give a speech in front of a pool of blood and an inverted cross, and his evangelical supporters wouldn't mind as long as he owned the libs during the speech.
Yeah, I mean, it's martyr's blood, and that's the cross of St. Peter. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, I mean, Vivek Ramaswamy, who, granted, is on the outs right now, but was at one point a big Trump guy. Is a Hindu.
I was just asking about Yarvin because people in the comments were asking about surely he likes cathedrals. That's being based.
I see.
His trad reaction. But the thing is, I think that's the thing with Curtis Yarvin. He's not trad. I don't think he's trad at all. He doesn't seem trad at all to me.
No, I don't get the slightest trad vibes from him, which is funny because people he has a lot of fans who are.
He's much more the accelerationist guy.
Yeah. He has there are people who have I don't know, Crusader Knight imagery in their Twitter, obvious that love Curtis Yarvin, right? Because he says enough things that overlap with what they like. but yeah, he himself is like, I don't know. I mean, he's like, he's sort of against the 20th century, but I don't know that his preferred century would really be the same as these people, right? I mean, like, he talks a lot about how much he loves Thomas Carlyle, and I don't know, Disraeli. It's like a
Man, anyone's whose favorite century is the 19th century is nuts.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But I think that's the thing. I think he probably, I don't know. I think he'd probably like to, return to, like, I don't know, like the late 1780s or something, right? It's like it's unclear to me. Like, I guess he'd probably, I guess he probably would want to go. Yeah, maybe it would be like a little bit earlier, just because he doesn't seem to be like particularly fond of any of the like classic bourgeois revolutions. There's this weird.
He's gonna travel back in time and convince the founding fathers to form a based republic, where George Washington is the cool, epic, not king.
Yeah, I mean, so there's this exchange that he did a year or two ago with Christopher Rufo, where it's like a written debate on some website, and it actually makes really funny reading. I should do a Substack on it sometime, because Rufo is clearly like pretty annoyed by Yarvin's shtick. But there's a point in there where Yarvin talks about, like, he has this weird, annoying metaphor about like Plato's cave, and how he's like, oh, there's like always another, there's always another layer of the cave to like get out of or whatever. And
I really think Curtis Yarvin's like really trying to do the deep, mysterious, like mystic trad thing, while actually his politics is like very modernist, straightforward, and just bad in quite a usual way.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so at one point when he's developing this metaphor about how there's always a further cave, he says, something like, I can't wait, Chris, until you figure out that, Thomas Paine was also just a leftist. Or it doesn't even say Thomas Paine. That would make more sense than what he says. He says Samuel Adams was also just a leftist.
Yeah, it's fucking against the centrism of the 1770s.
yeah, exactly. And yeah, he does. And like, yeah, a lot of our conversation in Chicago was also him just sort of adamantly refusing to make any distinctions between anything that's to his left. So like,
someone mentioned Breivik and Mandela, I think, in the comments earlier.
Yeah, so this is actually one of the points that the New York Times interviewer brought up, which I'm happy to see. Like, I kind of didn't say much about it in the essay, because I've said what I have to say about Yarvin and race stuff in previous, the last time I wrote about him. I don't know that I have anything to add now, but I was happy to see him asked about this, because honestly, I think more interviewers should bring this stuff up, because like usually people are sort of so fascinated by the anti-democracy stuff they never really get to the race stuff. But yeah, so the New York Times interviewer brought up Yarvin saying, I don't know why you want me to condemn, something like, that he thinks that it's ridiculous for people to condemn Anders Breivik without first condemning Nelson Mandela, which is, and his defense of it in the New York Times article as well. The ANC was on the State Department's like list of terrorist organizations, up until whatever, the early 90s.
Until they won.
Yeah, until they won, exactly. It's like, okay, but are we all just supposed to take it for granted that like the State Department?
Yeah, I mean, it's very
right?
tiresome thing where instead of kind of actually drawing out kind of what you think the similarities are between Breivik in the ANC's armed campaign, you'll just be like, they both involve bombs. Can't you see it?
Yeah,
Like, it's incredibly intellectually unimpressive.
Yeah, right, exactly. It's like, oh, well, what kind of targets were being bombed and in service of what political program? Like, these might be morally relevant distinctions, between the two cases.
I
But
mean, Breivik certainly killed way more white people.
it's also true. Uh, yeah, certainly all at once. Yeah. I mean, it's funny because it's like people, I would also see this being brought up. People bring up the ANC and the sort of memory of like the armed struggle in South Africa to make all kinds of like spurious, poorly thought out points. It's like, so similarly, I'd see people be like, oh, why should I condemn Hamas? Blah, 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 1980s South Africa. It's like, yeah, guys, do you actually know anything about South Africa in the 1980s? Because like, the armed wing of the ANC was not going around just murdering random white people for being white. Like that was not all what they did.
Yeah, like it never really got going even that much, like the ANC's armed campaign was present, but was like significantly less than the provisional IRAs.
Right, exactly. And like, again, they just really weren't like, I'm not saying that the like armed wing of the ANC never did anything, that was bad or objectionable at any point or whatever. It's like, obviously, real history is messy and like isn't going to fit with any sort of romanticized
operation in us.
But like, they really weren't going around just, massacring random civilians like that. That's just not accurate.
Yeah, I think people think that like the Shoot the Boa song is like based on true events.
Yeah, right. That was just like, that just like represented what was going on left and right in like South Africa in the 70s and 80s. It's like really was not. Like there were lots of white people in the ANC. That like the South African Communist Party was like a major.
I was going to say they were needy old communists.
Yeah. It's like the SACP was a huge part of the struggle against apartheid, along with the ANC and the Trade Union Federation COSATU, and like, lots and lots of white people in the South African Communist Party. Like it's just like they really, for both strategic and ideological reasons, they really wouldn't have gone around, being like, oh, where are some white people at? Like, let's shoot them. But yeah. So anyway, hot take. I think the ANC was good and Anders Breivik was bad, but that's that's like the.
Have you seen how Anders Breivik has recently been getting his political messaging out?
No.
When he goes for a court trial, he'll shave something in the side of his head.
Sure.
So he's recently done 14, and he's recently done a Z.
Yeah, I had, often when I'm talking about how it is possible to have a much less harsh and punitive criminal justice system at the same time as having less crime, if you have, if you deliver greater material equality, I'll bring up Norway and say like, even Anders Breivik will probably eventually get out of jail. But yeah, Matt Brunig like pushed back against that a little while ago on Twitter, and he made, he made it like, yeah, he probably is not getting out if he doesn't chill out of the Nazi stuff sooner, which is actually totally fair, right? Norway doesn't have life in prison without parole, but
yeah, if you just keep going, no.
Yeah, you can just keep being like, no, sorry, no, right? So yeah, if he keeps shaving messages into his head every time he has a hearing, he's probably never going to get out. But which fair enough, I suppose. But yeah, so there's a fair amount of stuff like that. The New York Times interviewer also brings up Yarvin's history of making insane comments about slavery, which I guess get closer to the last thing that we talked about. We talked about Yarvin, with the Haitian Revolution stuff that came up in my debate with him. But what I found most interesting in Yarvin's pitch for whatever he means by monarchism, as ambiguous it is, in the New York Times, was that he makes this argument that in a weird way is very much like a socialist argument, but with the pluses and minuses reversed. That he says, hey, look at all of these things that are like, look at all of the companies that deliver these like good products that we all want. They're all run as monarchies, right? So clearly monarchy is the way to be efficient and to get stuff done, right? So, we all get our iPhones from Apple, which is run as a monarchy, he actually does like have a funny, it's one of his standard lines, but it's kind of funny to see him use it while talking to the New York Times, that the New York Times is a fifth generation hereditary monarchy, right? The family that owns it. And so why wouldn't we want monarchy in the political sphere too? Which strikes me as interesting, because it's like, it's almost a precise inversion of the point that, like, for example, certainly the kind of thing that like Richard Wolff goes around saying all the time, but like also like, for example, the point that Marx makes in chapter 15 of Capital on machinery, where he's talking about factory codes, and he says like nowhere is nowhere in the way the capitalist runs his factory is that division of power, that's so beloved by the bourgeoisie and the political sphere, still less the much more favored representative system, right? So he's like, hey, Marx in Capital is essentially saying, like when the bourgeoisie is thinking about how they want to be ruled over politically, right? They want liberal democracy, right? Parliamentary government. But there's no liberal democracy on the factory floor, right? I mean, like they run that like these absolutist fiefdoms, and
yeah, I think it was something I learned from McManus, that this kind of contradiction was the contradiction that like really soured meal on capitalism, especially capitalism as kind of it was experienced in the 19th century, where he's like, well, I would like there to be people to be these kind of autonomous, fully formed, like politically capable agents. But then for like most of their day, they're shunted into these places where they're treated as, more machine parts than men, which is something obviously Marx talks about a lot, that kind of within the factory, it's not just that there's increasing domination of machine parts, but increasingly the people within the factories become more and more like machine parts themselves.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah. That was very much the kind of thing that moved Mill, that he thought that, having to spend your life being subordinated, to the will of a capitalist was degrading. And, we, should, like, kind of for the sake of, liberal democratic values about equality, we should, in Mill's case, he's a little vague, but at least hope for, a evolution of the economy in some sort of more socialistic direction.
Do you know if Marx ever? So obviously, in his earlier writings, Marx talks about how the difference between a human and an animal is that, well, there's two, that humans can kind of throw up what they produce in their minds before they produce it, but also that animals produce in like a single way or within a certain narrow range, while humans can produce universally. Did he ever come back to that in later works and say, well, but actually in the factory, man becomes much more like the animal, who doesn't actually kind of throw up the thing in his mind. He's kind of just instructed through this basic set of things and doesn't produce universally. The proletariat definitely doesn't produce universally, but is kind of forced to produce in this very particular way.
Basically, he does in capital. I mean, like so the first part of what you said is what, is basically exactly what he says in chapter 7 on the labor process in general, right? He's sort of giving this like generic transhistorical description of the labor process. And he has this famous line about how, he has a couple of other non-human examples, but the one I remember the most is about honeybees and, intricacy of the honeycombs could, put, human architects to shame. But the difference is that the human produces the structure in his mind before he produces it in material reality. So that's the difference between the worst of architects and the best of bees. And then later in the book, might even be in chapter, anyway, whatever. Later, much later in the book, he does sort of return to the point and say, in capitalist production, I mean, he doesn't quite put it the way you do, but he says that in capitalist production, really the description he's giving just kind of sounds to me like class society in general, but whatever. That this is still going to hold true for the production process in general, but not for any particular individual, because like a particular individual might just be following orders. And so yeah, it's like I don't think he, at least in capital, he doesn't quite draw it out the way you just said, but implicitly the point is more or less there, right? So it's so, and this strikes me as a really interesting argument, right? That like, okay, we want to get stuff done in we want organizations that get stuff done efficiently, and so clearly the ones that are like that in the economy, are these extremely internally undemocratic capitalist firms. So clearly that works, that gets stuff done. So therefore, why do we want the political sphere to be democratic? Don't we want that to like efficiently get stuff done? And yeah, I mean, Yarvin, it's funny actually, because it's like there's Yarvin like really fetishizes like reading old books, again, Thomas Carlyle, Disraeli, he's like a surprisingly large part of my debate with him was about his contention that the fact that my understanding of history aligns with what most historians would say is actually a problem, because I'm just believing the historians, and instead of believing the historians, what you should do is you should like go back and like go on to like Google Scholar or whatever and like read old memoirs, and
cool.
That's which is also, by the way, like should take about 2 seconds of thought to be like, no, this is the worst way of trying to get an objective view of what happened in the past, because like people in their memoirs are trying to justify themselves, but whatever.
I mean, it's a very interesting practice if you have the time, but like,
sure, yeah, it's I'm sure it's a fun and interesting thing to do, right? It's just not primarily the primary mechanism by which you should try to figure out what actually happened, but yeah, so like he fetishizes like reading old books. He can have this like very like laconic and cynical like affect. Like oftentimes he even kind of comes off as sort of somewhat above the fray of the petty bullshit that's going on in day-to-day politics. This like just this guy who like enjoys feeling like he's a little bit he's a little bit detached with a little bit of a wider view, right? This is how he likes to come off. Then whenever he talks about these tech startups, like he just sounds like he's writing just the most credulous possible like copy for the business press. Like it's just like
he's on his stomach kicking his legs as he types on the laptop.
Yeah, I mean he's just exactly. He's just like he just sounds like he's just writing like the silliest
The craziest thing was that I didn't know this before, but you quote him as basically making fun of the idea if instead of having Silicon Valley, there was like the California Department of Computers or whatever. And it's like, that happened. That's how they invented the internet and stuff. It was all public schools and public universities and fucking like military research facilities. That's how they invented the internet, and that's how they invented computers. And I was like, what the hell?
No, exactly. Like,
and then they just turned them all over to the private companies, and they made infinite money. Of course, like, you know, private companies have innovated in computer technology, but like, no, there was basically a California Department of Computers, and it did so much.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like when he appeals to this like very knee-jerk, oh haha, we could all see how ridiculous this would be, right? Imagine instead of Silicon Valley, we had the California Department of Computing. But it's like, look, a lot of it was federal, and it wasn't just one department. It was like spread out, right? But it's like, you're exactly right. That is basically what happened, right? Like this idea that like the tech sector that he idolizes so much, like came up with all of its own inventions is just not reality. You know, the only context in which I will ever recommend that anybody watch a TED Talk is, you know, Mariana Mazzucato is this Italian economist. She wrote a book called The Entrepreneurial State. And she does this thing, right, in talks where she'll like hold up a smartphone and be like, look, you know, the sort of story you have in your heads is this is like a testament to the innovative genius of the private sector, but it's like, it's not true. Right? It's like everything that makes this thing a smartphone, not a dumb phone, was basically innovated, you know, in the public sector in one form or another. I mean, the you know, the actual touchscreen technology, the global positioning system, the internet, right?
Yeah.
Like all of this stuff, right, came from public universities, you know, grants from the federal government, you know, stuff that was research that was going on in the Defense Department, etc. Right. So his premise that like it's these you know, genius mini monarchical tech CEOs who are like driving forward technological innovation is just empirically not right. I mean, that's one of you know, my three.
I think like within the private sector, it also seems quite clear that like most of the innovation happens before these companies become massive and monopolized. Like Apple and Microsoft were doing like some real innovative shit in the 90s. And now it's all just trying to force you to like do AI bullshit that you don't need and making the iPhone like slightly bigger with worse battery life. Like first iPod, first iPhone, incredible innovation. iPhone, not really. Like I'm not impressed, you know.
Yeah. I mean, it's just that's like so again, I think his premise about how this works in Silicon Valley is not really right. I'd also point out that his assumption that you can kind of only have a, you know, viable enterprise if it's run this way is also pretty dubious, right? I mean, you know, Mondragon exists, right? For example, you know, I think there are structural reasons why cooperatives always make up a really tiny portion of capitalist economies, right? I mean, just given the sort of standard rules for how capitalist markets work, you do have all these competitive advantages. You know, if you could separate labor from capital, you know, it's obviously much easier to move around, for example, you know, because you can just lay people off and hire new people, you know, where you land. But again, I think that like the idea that it's that you're just going to have like horrible internal inefficiency if you don't have separation of labor and capital is also empirically dubious.
One of Britain's high school high school, high street retailers is a workers' cooperative.
Right.
And the fact that you wouldn't be able to tell which one it
Right.
is unless I told you indicates both that Yarvin and people who think that co-ops are like the thing are both wrong.
Right. Yeah. So is it like I'm guessing this place. I mean, I'm not familiar with the example, but I'm guessing this is like it's like a ESOP kind of thing, right? The like employee stock ownership plan.
It's I can't exactly remember how it's John Lewis. I can't exactly remember how their structure worked, but I think how it plays out for the workers is that they get to vote on like a very few amount of things, and when the store makes profit, they get a dividend.
Right.
But otherwise, it basically functions exactly how any other place does.
Right. It's just run like a normal company. Yeah. You know, so yeah, I mean, I
The
think
funny thing is, it's called John Lewis and Partners, and that's all their employees. They're the and.
They're the and. That's funny, actually. Yeah. So I just finished reading this book, the Thomas Piketty and Michael Sandel, Equality, What It Means, Why It Matters. Gonna write a review of that. And one of the funny things is that Piketty these days, I mean, he's come a long way. I seem to recall in 2016 him supporting Hillary Clinton, but he's come a long way politically since then, but in this like slightly ambiguous way. So like he says at one point in here that he thinks that like he wants elected representatives of workers to make up at least 50% of board seats at companies. And it just really hit me when I was reading that it's like, look, in any society that had actually implemented that, like I think this would be a very unstable halfway house, because surely in a society where that would be implemented, like people would immediately start to question, right? I mean, once it got to that point, right, it was like a majority worker representatives, like, hold on, wait a second. We all just get like one vote, right? Like, how is it that you could just buy like a bunch of votes, you know, for the remaining like 49% or whatever, right? Like, I think like if you somehow got people to accept that, I think they'd very quickly want to, you know, go further than that. But yeah,
how John Lewis works, and they basically get around the democracy thing by it being entirely workers owned, but it's held in trust.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Which basically means it's not managed by the workers. They own it, but they don't manage it, and they get the money such as it is. But then there's kind of a board which manages it for them.
And they don't get to elect the board. There's like a...
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly, but yeah.
Okay, we will look into how John Lewis and Partners works and correct the record in a future episode. But yeah, you can't buy votes here, but you can buy chat display. So yeah, so I think that like half of the problem with Yarvin's argument for capitalism for monarchy, right, which is again a really fun argument, because you know, like the sort of fundamental premise that capitalist firms are more like monarchies than democracies is one that you very rarely hear from people who like capitalism. You know, you almost always hear it from people who dislike capitalism. But you know, whatever, true premise either way. So so that's half the problem, that his sort of assumption that, you know, you need workplace despotism to get economic efficiency, and like that's why, you know, these tech companies that he idolizes are able to make these amazing devices or whatever. I think that premise is like flawed in many ways. So that's like half the problem. But the other half of the problem with this is that I guess what I would think of as a basic, like I don't put it quite this way in the essay, but it's like basically a Humean kind of objection, which is like, okay, just because an organization is very efficient at pursuing its goals, that doesn't actually tell me anything yet about whether this is a good thing, right? I mean, I would have to know that.
It goes to the fact value distinction, right? That you just recently did another Substack article
Yeah.
about. Right? It's like, no, I would kind of prefer tobacco companies to be quite inefficient with how they do things.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't really want to draw that tendency out too much because I don't want the just bits of the economy which don't work well. Rather, you should actually change things so that if you think tobacco companies are bad, they just shouldn't exist. But in the meantime, yeah, I'm not really enthused about if they're efficient, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah, how good it is for an organization to be efficient in pursuing its goals entirely depends on how good those goals are. And, you know, so yeah, a very efficiently run slaughterhouse is not good news for the cow, right? Like, this is like an entire, you know, so it's like, yeah, sure, let's just assume for the sake of argument that an American monarchy would be like really efficient, which, by the way, I would point out that the history of actually existing monarchies does not necessarily support that contention, but whatever, right? I suppose.
I mean, it would probably be run like how Elon Musk is trying to run America, where like he makes non-binding Twitter polls.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Right.
Yes, we go on.
No, sorry, I'm just imagining like if Elon Musk like fulfilled Curtis Yarvin's dearest fantasy and became the Augustus CEO of America, and you know, and he's doing things.
He's fairly close. I'm really shocked that Trump hasn't got tied in yet, but maybe he has like hidden powers.
Yeah, it seems like, yeah, I mean, people have been saying, and it does feel true, that sooner or later those two are going to have a falling out. Like just given the size of those egos, it seems hard to imagine that not happening. But sure hasn't happened yet.
If Trump sees the post where it's like, "Oh, actually, Elon's president," he would see his ass off.
Right? One would think
to break the American oligarchy, we just need to put a phone with those Twitter posts like in Trump's face.
But yeah, I mean, so if Musk is already quite close, you know, so I was just imagining if he like made it all the way, and then he's doing like non-binding Twitter polls about whether he should invade Mexico and shit.
It's democracy.
Yeah.
Curtis Yarvin's posting articles about why Musk must stop making Twitter polls. He needs to be a true Augustus. Stop consulting the plebs.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it just seems like, in fact, you know, the standard. I mean, this is a very, very boring normie point, but I mean, there's something to it. The standard mechanism for trying to align what governments do with the, you know, with the goals we'd like them to be pursuing, or at the very least minimize the extent of disalignment, is by having elections. So if we got rid of that, I mean, I really don't know what the mechanism would be. So it just sort of seems like, in order to believe this, you would just have to believe that, you know, I don't know, I guess you'd want monarchy, and then like you just sort of hope that you got a monarch that did the things that you'd want them to do. I mean, I'd also point out that
it starts again to think of like, well, I guess it becomes Darwinian, right? But then you know, America becomes the Roman Republic in the sense of like whatever tech oligarch has the loyalty of the most divisions.
Yeah, right. Which is also the thing, right? Like it's always been funny to me that fascists like associate the Roman Empire with these ideals of like, you know, here's this like stable, orderly society. It's like, man, they had civil wars like once every 20 years. Like,
yeah, I mean, incredibly impressive state structure, but they never quite worked out succession.
Yeah, exactly. And
that went
in
on for 1,000
fact,
more years in the East.
to go with to go with Yarvin's fondness for the Augustus metaphor, it's like, yeah, I don't know. Think about what happened after Augustus. Like, even just stick with the rest of the Julio Claudians, right? Like who comes immediately afterwards?
You know the story about with the four good emperors and their successors, and then their successors.
Well, yeah, because the people who are referred to as the four good emperors, who and by the way, once again, we want to like be a little bit like the way the word "good" is being thrown around here. I understand what people mean, but it's like one of those people, Marcus.
The not fucked up emperors who didn't burn it all down.
Yeah, exactly right. It's like sort of more or less good for like a certain kind of imperial stability and like competence. Like that's what they mean by good. It's like some of these people are also trying to do things like genocide the Gauls, but whatever. But yeah, like those guys all sort of picked successors to the first three, right? Picked successors to leave the throne to, basically. But they didn't do that because like they were wise and they realized that would be better than leaving it to their fuck up kids. They just did it because they didn't have heirs, right? They could have.
Yeah, and it's also funny that kind of the most philosophically inclined of them, the fourth one, was just like, oh fuck it, I'll give it to my son. I don't care, he's an idiot.
Yeah, right. So Marcus Aurelius does leave it to Commodus, who's the bad guy from the first Gladiator movie, and and in fact, to really underline that point, I remember because like, okay, when that movie came out, it's 2001, so it's before, it's before the Wikipedia era, right? So I remember just leaving the theater thinking, man, I'm pretty sure that's not what happened, but it's like, whatever, right? Like there's no sort of immediate way to look it up in 2001 that would have occurred to me, at least. So I just kind of didn't think about it after that. I was like joking with my friends as we left the theater about the fact that it seemed like a very unrealistic ending, but like none of us really knew. And then many years later, I was watching, or I guess at that point rewatching the HBO show Rome. And I got curious about some of the historical details in that show. So I went down a little Wikipedia rabbit hole. And then I remembered leaving the theater when I was watching Gladiator and be like, oh, I should look this up, right? So looking up Commodus, like, man, the real guy was much worse and much more insane than the character in the movie. Like, much more. Like, he renamed the city of Rome after himself temporarily, Colonia Commedia. He renamed like all the months in the calendar after his names. He was obsessed with the idea that he was the reincarnation of Hercules, and he had like and he put like statues of himself as Hercules all over. He actually would sometimes fight in the gladiatorial arena, which is like for the sensibilities of the Roman aristocracy, like an emperor hanging out in a gladiatorial arena. I think this is Mike Duncan's analogy. It was like the approximate equivalent of if Trump started hanging out in crack houses.
If Trump fought in the UFC instead of commentating on it.
Yeah. So he actually did do that, but he'd do things like he'd have like with the Hercules thing, he'd dress up as Hercules, and he'd have a bunch of cripples tied together and dressed up as a giant so he could fight it. It's just That's so much more luridly insane than the character in the movie. And yeah, that was Marcus Aurelius' son. So it's like, yeah, maybe, I don't know, maybe certainly hereditary monarchy doesn't seem to be a recipe for having even competent administrators. Never mind any standard that goes beyond that.
Do you want to hear some John Lewis facts before we knock off?
Sure.
So they elect a partnership council, and the partnership council has a twice annual meeting with the the chairman, then they vote on whether they still have confidence in the chairman. But there's no indication if that actually leads to the chairman losing his position or if it's just kind of a
Okay.
non-binding thing. And then three of 8 of the executive board or whatever are elected. So very
Okay.
specifically
So
not a majority.
okay. Gotcha. Yeah. So it's like it's very, so it's like a little bit like, yeah, so it's a very distant, it's very distant from any sort of democratic control. It's like
It reminded me a lot of Chinese democracy, which you can take how as you will. But
sure,
it's like
Chinese
lots of
democracy,
layers.
I was kind of even thinking about like the internal structures of the Catholic Church. It's not like the College of Cardinals like runs it on any kind of ongoing basis. Yeah, okay, fair enough. Well, last point I think is worth mentioning from the Yarvin interview, just because it's this is philosophy for the people, and I think we kind of can't not, is that Yarvin says an extremely Yarvinish thing in the interview, which is that he says, so the interviewer says there was reporting in 2017 by BuzzFeed. They published some emails between you and the right-wing provocateur Milo Yiannopoulos, where you talked about watching the 2016 election with Peter Thiel, and you referred to Thiel as, quote, fully enlightened, unquote. What would fully enlightened have meant in that context?
Absolutely off his tits.
And Yarvin goes on, and without saying very much, it says fully enlightened for me means fully disenchanted. When a person who lives within the progressive bubble of the current year looks at the right or even the new right, what's hardest to see is what's really shared is not a positive belief, but an absence of belief. We don't worship these same gods. We do not see the New York Times and Harvard as divinely inspired in any sense, or we do not see their procedures as ones that have always led to truth and wisdom. We do not think the U.S. government works well. The interviewer, who, by the way, one of the funniest things about this interview is that the interviewer is like constantly expressing impatience with like how much Yarvin rambles in his answers. The interviewer cuts in and says, and this absence of belief is what you call enlightened? Yarvin, yes, it's a disenchantment from believing in these old systems. And the things that should replace that disenchantment is, we need to do things Curtis's way. It's basically just a greater openness of mind and a greater ability to look around and say, we just assume that our political science is superior to Aristotle's political science because our physics is superior to Aristotle's physics. What if it isn't so? And there are many things I love about this passage. One is just that there's the only thing resembling an argument here could fairly be summarized as, I don't know, man, you just got to open your mind. What if I'm right? It's like, okay, sure. Do you have a reason to think that you're right? Or is this just like one of the million possibilities that I'm supposed to open my mind to? But then again, it's the sort of reference that I think Yarvin really likes to drop. And I think that his fans really like, because it makes them feel smart, right? That sentence, that we just assume that our political science is superior to Aristotle's political science because our physics is superior to Aristotle's physics. It's like, that's deep, right? That makes you think. But it's like, okay. Does anybody like the idea? Yarvin seems like, does Yarvin think that that's why people disagree with him about democracy? That like they just feel the need to disagree with Aristotle about everything because Aristotle was wrong about physics? That seems very
It's
unlikely.
also like Aristotle definitely didn't want a fucking shop merchant to run the policy.
Also true.
Like, of anyone, he didn't want someone who made money, who was a profiteer. That he found that sort of thing absolutely disgusting.
Yeah, the charismatics. That's like the attempt to the attempt to engage in, like, engaging in buying and selling, not to get useful goods, but to maximize the amount of money that you had, was something that Aristotle very explicitly saw as a character failing. So yeah, he certainly wouldn't share Yarvin's enthusiasm for tech CEOs. But like also, it's like, okay, like even to the extent that there is overlap between the way that Yarvin thinks about politics and the way that Aristotle did, that they were both distrustful of mob rule or whatever, like it seems like the underlying argument here is Aristotle thought so, and look how smart he was. What, you think you're smarter than Aristotle? Come on.
Yeah, and also it's like as if Aristotle is an obscure philosopher as opposed to literally the number one ever.
Yeah. But it's like I don't like. I mean, you could play this game in so many different directions, right? Like, I don't know. I mean, this would just be like the left-wing equivalent of that. This would be the Einstein was a socialist argument. You know, that Einstein was a socialist. He wrote an article about it for the Monthly Review. All true, right? Therefore, you should be. It's like, well, no, that's probably the worst possible argument for socialism.
Right, and like Einstein was also one of those guys who was like, also philosophy is bad.
Well, I don't know if that's quite fair, but yeah, I think he was maybe influenced a little bit by positivist philosophy at the time, but it's like also like, I don't know. I mean, you know, it's actually funny. In my first book, I used this example, and to illustrate why this would be a bad argument, I was like, well, what about Heisenberg? Right? Brilliant physicist and, you know, Nazi. And and it turns out there are a lot of Heisenberg fans out there who are very offended by this. Who are like, well, actually, he was never a party member. And like, okay. At the very least, he was a sufficiently patriotic German to be willing to try to build a bomb for Hitler. So, you know, that strikes me as maybe somebody with politics we shouldn't imitate. You know, regardless of whether he's quite an according to Hoyle Nazi or not. But like, I don't know, we could even, you know, we could be like, hey, here's a like Aristotle. How about Plato? Plato says in the laws, or whatever the Athenian stranger says in the laws, that when he's, you know, recommending like laws they should adopt in a new city, that's, you know, so you don't have to worry about like trying to reform existing arrangements. You know, Plato says that you shouldn't allow the gap between the wealthiest and least wealthy citizen to grow beyond 5-1, because then you won't have a sense of, you know, community, and, you know, and so in fact, if this happens, you should be able to take the wealthy citizen to court and have their wealth taken away. And so, you know, it's like, what, you know, you think it's fine for Elon Musk to have $455 billion. You know, are you smarter than Plato? It's like, it's such a, you know, it's such a silly way to argue. And it's, you know, again, it's like, it sounds, I guess, sophisticated to, you know, to Yarvin fans with the right sensibilities, but it's like, it's just so fucking silly. Like, if you actually like try to break down what that means, or what, if any, argument there is underlying the sentiment, and also, like, I don't know, man, you want to know why people like democracy? It seems like we have a few hundred years of philosophers and political theorists writing about that. You could actually engage with one of what those guys say.
Yeah. What's on the docket next week then? Or like, I mean, what did you publish today first?
Okay, so today I published.
People going to Substack.
Yes, today, a few hours ago, I published an essay called Marxism and Fact Value Confusion, which was about what Marx means by materialism and how that's different, and how that's different from what he means by idealism, and basically why this has absolutely nothing to do with what a lot of internet Marxists think that these terms mean, and in particular that the idea that's held both by obviously some anti-Marxists, but also some Marxists, that like materialism in a Marxist way somehow entails like moral nihilism about metaethics is just.
I thought you'd written that one before, but maybe you hadn't written it. Actually, we just talked about these topics.
I wrote one that was similar. It was a little bit different, but yeah, I wrote one that was. I wrote one that was definitely a variation on the. Actually, I'm sorry, I'm being stupid. That was last week's essay, right?
Yeah,
was the one we're talking about. Sorry, you're right. So what I just described to you was last week's essay, because it's been a couple weeks since we talked. Yes, this week's essay, the one that went up a few hours ago, was it was about this book that I mentioned earlier, the Piketty and Sandel equality book. So it's about the Rawls part of this book, and this, so Piketty has this kind of yeah, nope, yeah. I was literally just describing last week's essay. So Piketty has this criticism of Rawls, about Rawls's unwillingness to get to kind of get his hands dirty, engaging with the politics of the day, as he's like theorizing about high level political philosophy. And Sandel defends him, although he criticizes Rawls on other grounds. And basically, I think Piketty is right. So perhaps if we do a stream next week, we might talk about that. But we will certainly figure that out between now and then.
Cool. So when I clicked the start stream button, it offered me an option to put an intro video on. I'm just now wondering if I click the end stream button, it will offer me an outro video, or if the video will just abruptly end.
I don't know, because this is Jason's StreamYard account, and I do not know how he set it up. You want to find out?
I love to gamble. But what are you writing for next week before we go?
Yeah. For next week, so there are two that I'm undecided between. So one of them is there's a video by megachurch pastor Douglas Wilson accusing his enemies of epistemic arrogance, and that epistemological arrogance, I think he said, which definitely is like, oh man, that seems like a philosophy for the people essay, unpacking that. But I'm probably going to do one about replying to an essay by the libertarian philosopher Michael Huemer.
Cool. Because Huemer's he's better than your usual fare of libertarians.
Yeah. He's definitely out of the libertarians I've debated. He's probably the he's probably the one who's.
Isn't he a vegan?
Yeah, he's a vegan. He does a lot of the. He's a vegan. He likes effective altruism. He's one of those guys. He's definitely probably the smartest, or certainly at least the most philosophically sophisticated, libertarian.
Yeah, I mean, it's just because he's a philosophy professor, right?
Yeah, sure, right, exactly, yeah. yeah, I mean, a libertarian I've written about who's also a philosophy professor is Jason Brennan, but I don't see that debate happening anytime soon because he's very he very adamantly hates me, and like
I think you'd say like he's dead.
yeah, no, he's with it. He's alive and well. He just like we
And his hate for me is alive and well.
yes, he and his hate for me are both alive and well. Like he's posted crazy stuff about me, and he, despite that, he also me and Matt McManus are editing a collection of essays about Cohen, and we invited him to do one just because we wanted somebody on the other on the other side, right, to do a critical essay in there. And he's written about Cohen before, and Matt did the outreach, but he was still like, no, I'm not going to do that because Ben Burgis is involved with it. So there you go. I guess he must feel I've misrepresented his views somehow, but if so, one would think we could engage in a little dialogue to sort that out. But apparently it's not to be. So in any case, yeah. So yeah, but humor's fine. He's just wrong about everything, but he's fine. In any case, yeah. So probably writing that for next week. We will probably be doing one of these next week, especially because we're gonna have to skip the week after that. I'm gonna be in Texas for a conference. But next week I will.
With Rogan.
Yeah, it's the Joe Rogan conference for UFC and DMT studies.
Weed and whiskey.
What's that?
Weed and whiskey.
Yeah, well, I'll go to that conference. Yeah, it's the Nicholas Kiersey. It's his thing. It's the Caucus for Critical Political Science.
Critical political.
Yeah, critical political science, and so it's like Cedric Johnson is the keynote speaker. There's Varn at one point was scheduled to give a presentation at this conference, although I think he ended up having a time conflict. I have a paper that I'm co-writing with my friend Michael Seckman that's I'm going to be giving at the conference. That's like a response to William Clare Roberts and some other people on the idea of class abstractionism that we sort of briefly touched on the other week, which I suppose there'll almost certainly be a Substack about that at some point in the future. But in any case, yeah. But next week I'll probably be okay. So we've got the so yeah, Jason and I have the divorced podcasters, Valentine's Day hangout at the Rainbow Bar and Grill on Friday at 6 p.m. In Hollywood, California. Anybody wants to come out to that? And then then on Saturday, actually, both of us are going to be speaking at a panel at UC Irvine. At noon, I want to say. If you follow my social media, I will post details when I have it, but that's going to be about neoliberalism. But Sunday, I should be back here and able to stream, I think. So we will talk about, I don't know, something.
Cool. I'm going to live dangerously and click the end stream button.
Nice.
Yeah, you get to choose a video. Bye, everyone.